Culture in ancient China. Chinese culture. Modern knowledge about artistic achievements in ancient civilizations is limited because often little has survived the ravages of time. Fortunately, many ancient civilizations, such as Egypt and Mesopotamia, were located in relatively arid areas where many artifacts were preserved by the dryness, even over thousands of years. In many humid regions, such as China and South Asia, however, the cultural residue left by the civilizations of antiquity has been adversely affected by climate. As a result, relatively little remains of the cultural achievements of the prehistoric Chinese, aside from Neolithic pottery and the relics found at the site of the Shang Dynasty capital at Anyang. In recent years, however, a rich trove from the time of the Qin Empire has been unearthed near the tomb of Qin Shi Huangdi near Xi'an and at Han tombs nearby, but little remains of the literature of ancient China, and almost none of the paintings, architecture, and music have survived. But in relation to metalwork and sculpture, discoveries at archaeological sites indicate that ancient China was a society rich in cultural achievement. The pottery found at Neolithic sites such as Longshan and Yangshao exhibits a freshness and vitality of form and design, and the ornaments such as rings and beads show a strong aesthetic sense. Bronze casting. The pace of Chinese cultural development began to quicken during the Shang Dynasty, which ruled in northern China from the 16th to the 11th century BCE. At that time, objects cast in bronze began to appear. Various bronze vessels were produced for use in preparing and serving food and drink in the ancestral rites. Later vessels were used for decoration or for dining at court. The method of casting was used. The casting used was one reason for the extraordinary quality of Shang bronze work. Bronze workers in the Shang Dynasty and most ancient civilizations used the lost wax method, which is a model that was first made in wax. After a clay mold had been formed around that, the model was heated in order that the wax would melt away, and the empty space was filled with molten metal. In China, clay molds composed of several sections were tightly fitted together prior to the introduction of the liquid bronze. This technique, which had evolved from a ceramic technique used during the Neolithic period, enabled the artisans to apply the design directly to the mold and thus contributed to the clarity of line and rich surface decoration of the Shang bronzes. Bronze casting became a large-scale business, and more than 10,000 vessels of an incredible variety of form and design survive today. Factories were located not only in the Yellow River Valley, but also in Sichuan province in south and southern China. The art of bronze working continued into the Zhou dynasty after the Shang, but the quality and originality declined. The Shang bronzes remain the pinnacle of creative art in ancient China. And again, bronze was a mixture of copper and tin. One reason for the decline of bronze casting in China was the rise in popularity of iron. Again, the Shang bronzes remain the pinnacle of creative art in ancient China. Iron making developed in China around the 9th or 8th century BCE, much later than that in the Middle East, where it had been mastered almost 1,000 years earlier. One familiar with the process, however, the Chinese quickly moved to the forefront. Iron workers in Europe and the Middle East, lacking the technology to achieve the high temperatures necessary to melt iron ore for casting, were forced to work with wrought iron, a cumbersome and expensive process. By the 4th century BCE, the Chinese had invented the technique of the blast furnace, powered by a worker operating a bellows. They were therefore able to manufacture cast iron ritual vessels and agricultural tools centuries before an equivalent technology appeared in the Western world. Another reason for the deterioration of the bronze casting tradition was the development of cheaper materials such as lacquerware and ceramics. Lacquer, made from resins obtained from the juices of sumac trees native to the region, had been produced since Neolithic times, and by the 2nd century BCE, it had become a popular method of applying a hard coating to objects made of wood or fabric. Pottery, as well, had existed since early times, but technological advances led to the production of a high-quality form of pottery covered with a brown or gray-green glaze. The later, the gray-green glaze, known popularly as celadon. By the end of the first millennium BCE, both lacquerware and pottery had replaced bronze in popularity, much as plastic goods have replaced more expensive materials in our own time today. The first emperor's tomb. In the year 1974 CE, in a remarkable discovery, farmers digging in a well about 35 miles east of Xi'an unearthed a number of terracotta figures in an underground pit about 1 mile east of the burial mound of the first emperor of Qin. Chinese archaeologists sent to work at the site discovered a vast terracotta army that they believed was a recreation of Qin Shi Huangdi's imperial guard, which was to accompany the emperor on his journey to the next world. One of the astounding features of the terracotta army is its enormous size. The army is enclosed in 4 pits that were originally encased in a wooden framework, which has disintegrated. More than 1,000 figures have been unearthed in the first pit, along with horses, wooden chariots, and 7,000 bronze weapons. Archaeologists estimate that there are more than 6,000 figures in that one pit alone. And again, there are 4 of them. More equally impressive is the quality of the work. Slightly larger than life size, the figures were molded of finely textured clay, and then they were fired and then painted. The detail on the uniforms is realistic and extremely sophisticated, but the most striking feature is the individuality of the facial features of the soldiers. Apparently 10 different head shapes were used and were then modeled further by hand to reflect the variety of ethnic groups and personality types that were in the army. The discovery of the terracotta army also shows that the Chinese had come a long way from the human sacrifices that had taken place at the death of the Shang sovereigns more than 1,000 years earlier. But the project must have been ruinously expensive and is additional evidence of the burden the Qin ruler imposed on his subjects. One historian has estimated that 1/3 of the national income in Qin times may have been spent on preparations for the ruler's afterlife. And think about also in Egyptian history how a lot of the time spent by the pharaoh was preparing for his own afterlife as well. The emperor's mausoleum has not yet been unearthed, but it is enclosed in a mound nearly 250 feet high, surrounded by a rectangular wall extending for nearly 4 miles. According to the Han historian Sima the ceiling was a replica of the heavens, while the floor contained a relief model of the entire Qin kingdom, with rivers flowing in mercury. According to tradition, traps were set within the mausoleum to prevent intruders, and the workers applying the final touches were buried alive in the tomb with its secrets. Precisely when writing developed in China cannot be determined, but certainly by Shang times. As the oracle bones demonstrate, the Chinese had developed a simple but functional script. Like many other languages of antiquity, it was primarily ideographic and pictographic in form. Symbols, usually called characters, were created to represent an idea or to form a picture of the object to be represented. For example, the Chinese characters for mountain, the sun, and moon were meant to represent the objects themselves. Other characters, such as big, a man with his arms outstretched, represent an idea. The character for east symbolizes the sun coming up behind the trees. Each character, of course, would be given a sound by the speaker when pronounced. In other cultures, this process led to the abandonment of the system of ideographs and the adoption of a written language based on phonetic symbols. The Chinese language, however, has never entirely abandoned its original ideographic format, so it is pictographic in form, although the phonetic element has developed into a significant part of the individual character. In that sense, the Chinese written language is virtually unique in the world today. And of course, pictographs in ancient cultures. Virtually all written language evolved from pictographs, representations of physical objects that were eventually stylized and tied to sounds in the spoken language. This, for example, you can look up charts that show pictographs that originated independently in three ancient cultures, and how the stylized modern characters into which the Chinese oracle pictographs evolved. And for example, you can think about Mesopotamian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphics, oracle bone script, and modern Chinese. For example, you can take words like sun, hill, water, man, and woman, and you can see how the pictographs have evolved over time. One reason the language retained its ideographic quality may have been the aesthetics of the written characters. By the time of the Qin dynasty, if not earlier, the written language came to be seen as an art form as well as a means of communication, and calligraphy became as well one of the most prized forms of painting in China. Even more important, if the written language had developed in the direction of a phonetic alphabet, it could no longer have served as the written system for all the peoples of the expanding Chinese civilization. Although the vast majority spoke a tongue derived from a parent Sinitic language, a system distinguished by variations in pitch, a characteristic that gives Chinese its lilting quality even today. The language spoken in various regions of the country differed from each other in pronunciation and to a lesser degree in vocabulary and syntax. For the most part, they were and are today mutually unintelligible, however. And so you have this Sinitic language, which is a system distinguished by variations spoken in by variations in pitch. It is a characteristic that gives Chinese a unique quality today. The Chinese answer to the problem was to give all the spoken languages the same writing system. Although any character might be pronounced differently in different regions of China, that character would be written the same way after the standardization undertaken by the Qin. Written characters would therefore be read by educated Chinese from one end of the country to the other. This became the language of the bureaucracy and the vehicle for the transmission of Chinese culture from the Great Wall to the southern border and beyond. The written language was not identical to the spoken form. However, it eventually evolved its own vocabulary and grammatical structure, and as a result, users of written Chinese required special training. The earliest extant form of Chinese literature dates from the Zhou dynasty. Again, you have the Shang, then the Zhou, and then the Qin. The Qin was the first empire. We get the best bronze from the Shang, and the earliest extant form of Chinese literature dates from the Zhou. It was written on silk or strips of bamboo and consisted primarily of historical records such as the Rites of Zhou, philosophical treatises such as the Analects, again, remember the Analects of Confucius in the Way of the Tao, and poetry as recorded in the Book of Songs and the Song of the South. In later years, when Confucian principles had been elevated to a state ideology, the key works identified with the Confucian school were integrated into a set of so-called Confucian classics. These works became required reading for generations of Chinese schoolchildren and introduced them to the forms of behavior that would be required of them as adults. A brief touch on music. From early times in China, music was viewed not just as an aesthetic pleasure, but also as a means of achieving political order and refining the human character. In fact, music may have originated as an accompaniment to sacred rituals at the royal court. According to the historical records written during the Han Dynasty, quote, "When our sage kings of the past instituted rites and music, their objective was far from making people indulge in the amusements of singing and dancing. Music is produced to purify the heart, and rites introduced to rectify the behavior." End quote. Eventually, however, music began to be appreciated for its own sake, as well as to accompany singing and dancing. A wide variety of musical instruments were used, including flutes, various stringed instruments, bells and chimes, drums and gourds. Bells cast in bronze were first used as musical instruments in the Shang period. They were hung in rows and struck with a wooden mallet. The finest were produced during the mid-Zhou era and are considered among the best examples of early bronze work in China. Some weighed more than 2 tons and covered a range of several octaves. Again, these are bells cast in bronze. They were first used as musical instruments in the Shang period. And the finest produced was in the mid-Zhou era. Bronze bells have not been found in any other contemporary civilization and are considered one of the great cultural achievements of ancient China. The largest known bell, dating from the Roman Empire times, for example, is less than 3 inches high. By the late Zhou era, bells had begun to give way as the instrument of choice to strings and wind instruments, and the purpose of music shifted from ceremony to that of entertainment. This led conservative critics to rail against the onset of an age of debauchery. Ancient historians stressed the relationship between music and court life, but it is highly probable that music, singing, and dancing were equally popular among the common people. The Book of History, purporting to describe conditions in the late 3rd millennium BCE, suggesting that ballads emanating from the popular culture were welcomed at court. Nevertheless, court music and popular music differed in several respects. Among other things, popular music was more likely to be motivated by the desire for pleasure than for the purpose of law and order and moral uplift. Those differences continue to be reflected in the evolution of music in China down to modern times. In the next Chinese reading, we'll go over the Han, the glorious Han Empire from 202 BCE to 221 CE, covering a range of about 400 years.